Indeed, this talk is about immunological responses to adolescent meningococcal vaccination. Oh, first I have nothing to disclosure, but let's move on. I have one slide of introduction, and I'm aware that there's an overlap between the two previous talks. However, I think it's a very important point to address. All meningococcal infections starts with colonization of the nasopharynx, and as Helen already told you, approximately 10% of the population carries the bacteria. Meningococcal carriage rates are highest in adolescents and young adults. However, in a recent Dutch study, we observed already a steep increase in meningococcal carriage before the age of 15, which was more related to lifestyle rather than age. As Miriam already told you, the catch-up campaign led to a reduction in meningococcal carriage in the adolescents, which resulted in a reduction of transmission to the unprotected and unvaccinated individuals, which is also known as herd protection. So due to this herd protection, vaccination of adolescents is now considered the key to protect the whole population against meningococcal disease. Two previous Dutch studies investigated the impact of the introduction of the Mencc vaccination in the year 2002. The proportion of individuals with protective antibody titers against Mencc are presented on the y-axis. Before the introduction of the Mencc vaccination, only a few individuals showed protective antibody titers against Mencc. The results of the second study, approximately 5 years after the introduction of the vaccination, indicated that there was a good response to the primary vaccination at the age of 40 months. However, antibody titers waned rapidly, and 3 years after this primary vaccination, only 1/3 of individuals had still protective antibody titers. Participants who have been vaccinated during the catch-up campaign are presented in the middle part of this figure, showing that antibody persistence increases with age. As the current Dutch NIP only includes a single Mencc vaccination at the age of 40 months, I made a prediction of the current immune status of the Dutch population, presenting in the screen bars. Due to the rapid waning immunity after the primary vaccination, it has to be expected that currently the adolescents don't have protective antibody titers. So to prolong the individual protection after the primary vaccination, but maybe even more important to sustain the herd protection in the population, an adolescent booster seems required. So to investigate the Mencc response to such a booster vaccination, a clinical trial was conducted in the year 2011. Healthy 10, 12 and 15-year-olds were enrolled in the study and received the booster vaccination, of course. A blood sample was collected before the booster vaccination, 1 month, 1 year, and 3 years after the booster vaccination. And approximately 90 participants were enrolled within each age group. It has to be noted that only the 10-year-olds in this study were primed at the routine age at 14 months of age, and that the 12 and 15-year-olds were primed during the catch-up campaign. Results of this study will be presented on this slide with the functional antibody titers against Mencc on the y-axis. It's good to know that an SBA titer, or functional antibody titer, of 8 is considered as the correlate of protection. Prior to the booster vaccination, still a lot of individuals showed protective antibody titers 9 years after their primary vaccination. 1 month after the vaccination, all individuals showed a good booster response, and 1 year after the vaccination, antibody titers declined. However, all participants had very high protective antibody titers, with the highest persistence in the 15-year-olds. 3 years after the vaccination, antibody titers further declined, but still all individuals had still protective antibody titers. And again, the highest persistence of antibody titers was observed in the 15-year-olds. Remarkable, we observed a much steeper antibody decay between 1 month and 1 year after the booster vaccination, compared to 1 year and 3 years after the vaccination, which is observed in this graph. So to estimate the long-term protection, we used a bi-exponential decay model, and this model predicted a mean duration of protection against Mencc after this booster vaccination of 16 years for the 10-year-olds, 46 years for the 12-year-olds and very, very long protection of around 270 years for the 50 years. However, the previous talk already mentioned that we observed a rapid increase of MenW disease in the Netherlands. So therefore, a quadrivalent MenACWY vaccine seems maybe more appropriate to introduce in the Dutch immunization program. So to compare the Mencc booster responses between the monovalent vaccine and the quadrivalent vaccination, a new clinical trial was conducted in the year 2013. And again, healthy 10, 12, and 15-year-olds were enrolled and were randomized to receive the monovalent or the quadrivalent vaccination. And a blood sample was collected before the booster vaccination and also 1 month and 1 year after the vaccination. Approximately 80 participants within each study group were enrolled, and now both 10 and 12-year-olds received the primary vaccination at the routine age of 40 months. Again, the results against Mencc are presented on this slide. And prior to the booster, we still observed some participants with protective antibody titers. However, the proportion of individuals with protective antibody titers before the booster vaccination was lower compared to the previous study. And at baseline, we didn't observe any significant differences between the 6 study groups. 1 month after the vaccination, all individuals showed a good booster response, except of one 10-year-old over here who received the quadrivalent vaccination. Again, we didn't observe any significant differences between the 6 study groups. 1 year after the vaccination, antibody titers declined, with higher persistence of Mencc antibody titers in the monovalent vaccine group compared to the quadrivalent vaccine group observed in all 3 age groups. However, still all 12 and 15-year-olds maintained high protective antibody titers against Mencc, and also we observed again an age-dependent persistence of antibody titers with the highest persistence in the oldest age group. Only 2 10-year-olds who received the quadrivalent vaccination showed unprotected antibody titers 1 year after the vaccination. Of course, of interesting, we assessed also the immune response against MenW after the primary vaccination for MenW in the participants who received the quadrivalent vaccine. 1 month after the vaccination, almost all individuals showed a good primary response against MenW, with all 12 and 15-year-olds showing protective antibody titers against MenW. 1 year after the vaccination, still all those 12 and 15-year-olds maintain high protective antibody titers against MenW, and only a few 10-year-olds, also these 10-year-olds who didn't show an antibody response against the vaccination, had unprotected antibody titers 1 year after the vaccination. Remarkable, we can divide the participants into 2 groups at baseline. One group with already pre-existent immunity against MenW before the primary vaccination, and one group with low unprotected antibody titers at baseline. So to investigate whether those individuals with already protective antibody titers at baseline observed a more booster response compared to those individuals, we performed a sub-analysis, which is presented on this slide. So at baseline, of course, 2 groups. One group with unprotected antibody titers against MenW, and one group with protective antibody titers or pre-existent immunity, likely due to natural infection, are presented. 1 month and 1 year after the primary vaccination, the participants with already pre-existent immunity observed higher antibody titers compared to participants with low antibody titers at baseline, which may have consequences for long-term protection after implementation of a vaccination. But more important, all participants who didn't respond to the vaccine, and also all participants who had unprotected antibody titers against MenW 1 year after the vaccination, started at baseline with unprotected antibody titers. Due to time limits, I showed you the response to MenW, but the same picture was actually drawn for MenA and MenY. So to summarize, adolescents showed a good monovalent Mencc booster response after the Mencc monovalent vaccine, with best persistence in the 15-year-olds, and all individuals show protective antibody titers 3 years after the booster vaccination. The antibody decay model estimated very long-term protection in all individuals. We observed a rapid increase of MenW disease in the Netherlands. Therefore, an adolescent quadrivalent MenACWY vaccine seems more appropriate to implement. And the clinical trials show that the Mencc antibody titers after the monovalent vaccine were significantly higher compared to the quadrivalent vaccination 1 year after the booster vaccination. However, all 12 and 15-year-olds in both vaccine groups maintain protective antibody titers against Mencc and also against MenW. So, as I mentioned in the first slide, we observed already a steep increase in meningococcal carriers before the age of 15. So therefore, 12 years seems the most optimal age to implement such a booster vaccination to reduce the risk of resurgence of Mencc disease in the whole population, but also to control the outbreak of MenW disease in the Netherlands. So to combine this information with all the information of the previous talk, I think it would be very interesting to maybe discuss how we could implement the vaccine in the Netherlands. So maybe we could implement a quadrivalent vaccine at the age of 12 years. However, approximately 14 years after the introduction of the Mencc vaccination, we still do see very low incidence of Mencc, particularly due to the catch-up campaign. So therefore, it's maybe better, or we can add also a catch-up campaign in the Netherlands for young adults and also, of course, for the adolescents. Of course, I want to like to thank a lot of people. First, all the participants who were enrolled in the studies. A lot of people of the RIVM who helped me with the study design, all the laboratory analysis, statistical analysis. I would like to thank Lieke Sanders, my promoter, Esther Eggersman, who is somewhere over here also, and in the back, who helped me with vaccinating all the individuals, but also with collecting all the blood samples. And of course, I would like to thank GSK for providing the vaccines.